And Mark, maybe just give us a couple minutes on how the world had changed from it. We'll do a whole separate episode deep dive on it, but maybe just preview what was sort of the main change that you identified of like, hey, the world has changed from a media perspective.
Yeah, so a lot of my thinking on this is from the book from our friend Martin Gurry that he wrote back in 2015 called I think it's called the Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. And so basically, it's like the world really did change. Like how information flows through the world really did change, not just with the arrival of the internet, but specifically with the arrival of social media. And so, it just so happens that like all of us who grew up over the last 70 or 80 years, like we grew up in an environment of primarily top-down media, in which there's, these sort of major kind of forces in, broadcast, TV or cable TV or newspapers and magazines where, editors and publishers and reporters, and they sort of write all the stories. And then, it's everybody else's job to kind of read them and keep up. To a world that looks, completely different, whereas it's basically everything is peer to peer. And so, hierarchy to network, and then centralized institution to, decentralized network. And, that's happening throughout the economy, and throughout society. And, there's good and there's bad to it. And there's, tons of arguments to be had about it, but it is happening. And so just, in the new world, it's just, you're not, if you're running a business, or running a movement, like you're just not going to do it through the traditional method. You may still participate to some extent, but you're going to primarily tell your own story, and you're going to go direct, and you're going to have your own relationship with your constituents or with your fans, or with your customers. And like in some sense, it all sounds like a truism and a cliche, but like I think there were a couple of tipping points where it really started to happen. And one was around 2015 because social networking kind of hit mainstream and smartphones hit mainstream around that time, which is when Martin wrote his book. But then I think really it's only been in the last 5 years when I think almost everybody, like let's say basically everybody under the age of 70 and a very large number of people over the age of 70 basically have shifted from top-down media as their main source of information to social media as their main source of information. And so it actually is relatively new to live in this world, in which the information really does flow differently. And so it's just a fundamental shift. And so I think, as a firm, we spent, as Ben said, we always had a big focus on marketing and in telling a story. We did that primarily through the old centralized channels from 2009 to, probably 2017 or something. But really since then it's been, at least as effective or more effective to kind of do it the new way. And it's like the old William Gibson thing. It's like the future is already here. It just isn't evenly distributed yet. Like everything I'm saying, people can like nod at, but like, as you know, Eric, like most companies have still not adjusted to this,
Right.
right? Most politicians have still not adjusted to this. Most entertainers have still not adjusted to this. Most sports leagues have still not adjusted to this. And so I think it's very important that we continue to do it. And then I think it's also important that we set an example for our portfolio companies.
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with kind of like the apparatus, right? Like, so there's from a company standpoint, you know what you do. Like, we know how to help entrepreneurs, this and that, and the other, what a product company knows how to build their product and so forth. And then it's like, okay, and now you've got to get your message out. How do you do that? And then the apparatus that gets your message out, all the people, all the kind of tools, all the channels are oriented, at least partially in the old world. And so, it actually is in some ways much longer to adjust than it is for the individual consumer who goes, oh, there's just better stuff over here.
Yeah. And Mark, also talk about the shift from corporations to individuals in terms of kind of where brands went and who people want to hear from. Not to say there isn't, of course, a role for the corporation, but talk a little bit about that for the corporate brand.
Yeah, so let me rewind history a little bit. So it's actually pretty striking. Like this sort of decentralized media environment that we're entering is not new. It's actually very old. And correspondingly, the centralized media environment we all grew up in is not the historical norm. And so basically the way that we think about centralized top-down media today is basically an artifact of basically the period of the 1940s through, essentially the 1970s. Like before the 1940s, you didn't have top-down media in the same way. If you go back to the 1930s or before, you had a much larger number of newspapers. You had a much larger number of radio stations. You had a much larger number of sort of fly-by-night publishing operations, pamphlets and so forth. And then if you go back even further, one of the most interesting things to study on this is just go back to the American Revolution, the time of the colonies in the 1760s through like the 1790s. And It basically, I've been rereading some of this stuff recently. Like basically, the media environment of the colonial American era was a lot like today's social media environment. You would have 15, 20, 30 little newspapers per city. They would be in like, they would occupy every micro sliced niche. Talk about echo chambers or whatever. Like they each have their own little echo chamber. The founding fathers would write all these columns and essays. They would fight things out by writing essays, and then they would publish the essays under pseudonyms. And you have these characters like Benjamin Franklin or Alexander Hamilton that would literally have like a dozen or 2 dozen pseudonyms at a time. They'd actually get in fights with themselves. They'd have their pseudonyms actually fight with each other. Ben Franklin used to set off arguments against his different pseudonyms to drive, to really like litigate out an issue and to drive newspaper sales. But like really serious stuff also, like the Federalist Papers, which were kind of the explanation of the new Constitution in 1789. Hamilton and Madison wrote those under pseudonyms. Right. And so this idea of like the internet anon is like that's an old idea. And the idea of a pseudonym is an old idea. And the idea of like self-publishing is an old idea. And the idea of like basically these pitch smash mouth battles, with very little centralized control over what people say. Like, if you read about like how, like Hamilton and Jefferson, and then also Jefferson and Adams had these just like absolutely, they had their own basically pet newspapers, and they was just like absolute level of smash mouth politics. Like I would say even more like extreme and deranged than even what we have today. Which people kind of can't believe, but like if you read about the election of 1800, like it was I think it was more extreme than certainly any election in my lifetime in terms of like what it's literally John Adams and Thomas Jefferson like just like slandering.
So polarization is the norm.
Like really, like on every conceivable front. Yeah, so like polar, sort of as as they say, unfettered conversations were the norm. Anonymity was the norm. Rumor, scurrilous, accusations were the norm. Pitch back, sort of Overton window being wide open was the norm. And so, and just for people who want to read about this, the best book on this is called Infamous Scribblers, which was sort of the name for journalists in those days. And so like, this has happened before. And so anyway, so the point is like this sort of centralized media thing that we've been living in, that we grew up in, or, people my age grew up in, like it's a historical aberration off the norm. And again, it's a consequence of technology change. It's a consequence of this sort of mass publishing, mass media, mass radio, mass television, mass newspaper kind of thing that only started in the 1940s. And then correspondingly, therefore, Eric, to your question, like everything that we think of as corporate branding is an artifact of just a specific point in time of the sort of 1940s through call it the 1980s or something like that. All of like brand marketing, corporate brands, corporate messaging, corporate crisis management, like all these playbooks that they teach at business school were very specific to a time and place that had a very small number of centralized media outlets with tremendous influence and control. But therefore the corporate brand, like why does the corporate brand exist? Like why does a Procter & Gamble brand or any of these brands exist? It exists because if you have centralized media, information is going through this very narrow straw, right? There's very little bandwidth to get something on a TV, or very little bandwidth to get something in the newspaper, and therefore to get it to consumers' attention. And so you kind of had to wrap up everything about a company into like a single word and a single image. And then you would just, through advertising, you would just pound that over and over and over again, trying to get people to remember it. But that's because that's all you could do. If you open everything up and everybody can publish and everybody can debate and everybody can be present and everybody can, and then you have these, individual, influencers, with 200 million followers and all this stuff, like all of a sudden you have this completely different method of communicating with an audience that can be much more based on personality, right? So authenticity, transparency, and then personality, right? That there can actually be a human being. And then it just happens like, because your audience always consists of people relate much more to other people than they relate to a corporation, right? And so as an individual, am I going to feel a stronger emotional affinity to like a person who I follow, or to some like disembodied corporation with an office tower in New York City? And if the communication bandwidth is there where I can interact with both of them, of course I'm going to have a lot more affinity for the people. And so I think I'm sort of a radical in this. I think the whole idea of like corporate brands is basically just like it kind of they're on their way out. Like it's just as a concept, it just doesn't make sense in the new media environment. And then correspondingly, this like there's the terms people use these days like influencer marketing and so forth. But the parasocial relationship is actually really really interesting one. So sort of one to many personal relationships. I just think so much of how it's going to work in the future is based on relationships with individuals, and obviously, like this is happening, right? Everything I'm describing is what's happening in the entertainment industry, and it's happening, consumer brands, and you've got, Kim Kardashian with these multi-billion-dollar businesses, being direct marketed online. You have, many people doing this, many politicians, are now adapting to this, and so that this is happening. But I still feel like it's underestimated, and if we project forward 10 years. Most people are going to think about the people they relate to as opposed to the companies they relate to.
It's very interesting how you bring that up, Mark, about that, there were no kind of centralized medias and no corporate brands, or corporate brands weren't the thing kind of pre-1940s. Because as a kid, I always was surprised that I knew more entrepreneurs from like pre-1940 than so I knew Thomas Edison and Henry Ford and JP Morgan, but who are the entrepreneurs after that? And they weren't, they were just corporations, right? Like you didn't know actually who ran any of those things, even the new companies at the time. It just, it would leak out slowly and so forth, but it wasn't really a thing. And then now, we're getting all these celebrity CEOs again, are kind of, that idea is reemerging, which is fascinating.
Yeah, that's right. People kind of can't believe it, but like before, like 1930, like either you like literally you would just go to the store, or it was just like the corner store, and then you would buy like, a pan. And they weren't branded, like, maybe it was like Joe's store, but it wasn't like and so like the like consumer brands didn't exist in the modern sense. And then to Ben's point, like to the extent you knew any business that was at scale, it was, and businesses, prior to like 1930, they were almost all named after their founders, kind of for that reason, right? It was the Ford Motor Company. And then it was actually this, there's this whole school of psychology. It's actually, I think it was Freud's son-in-law, if I remember correctly, Edward Bernays, who was sort of the father of public relations. Was the new field in the 1920s when radio and newspapers took off, and centralized kind of media started to take off. And they sort of created this whole psychological theory of creating these sort of abstract brands for the reasons that I described. But by the way, which is very linked to the methods, also political propaganda, that became, kind of very successful, in those days. But it's just, it is amazing to me as this, like, there were hundreds of years of industrialization before that, and modern economic activity before that, where those things, essentially didn't exist. And that's why I'm so confident in sort of pegging all this to technology shifts, which is that, the thing that shifted how we think about companies happened as a consequence of the shifts in communication technology. And then correspondingly, if the communication technology unwinds, which is what's happening, then you're actually going to go back to the future. And then of course there's more data points to support that every day.